You are watching The Chorus in the Chaos Podcast, relevant and reformed thinking, by bringing a biblical worldview and a Christ-centered focus to the conversation.
Hello and welcome to The Chorus in the Chaos Podcast. My name is Jack, and I am joined, as always, by Blake and Grayson.
Ew.
And hello. And we are pressing forward. We're continuing to churn onward. We are in
I don't know if that's how churning works.
Yeah, I don't know.
Typically, it's a circular motion.
I would like to say, before we started recording, Jack said he had a really good intro.
Yeah.
I'm getting there. I'm warming up.
We're getting
warming up,
churned,
churning on. Yeah,
churning forward.
Churning, yeah.
Yeah. But no, we are continuing our series through the 10 Commandments, and we have made it to the 5th commandment. And but before we jump into that, before we talk about the 5th commandment, a couple of housekeeping items as usual. We want to thank our listeners. You guys have been fantastic. We see our listenership continue to grow. Thank you so much for the reviews on Spotify and Apple. Those things really, really do help. I see some statistics. They've started showing some of this stuff. I think I shared it before, but we see how people find the show. And we're continuing to see that more and more people find our podcast as it becomes recommended by Spotify. And that only happens because you guys leave reviews. So if you've never left a review, please leave us a 5-star review. It really does help other people find the show. Mm-hmm. Other than that, I think anything else by way of housekeeping, Blake, Grayson?
Not that I can think of.
I'm ready to jump in.
Okay. Well, so as I was preparing for this podcast, the 10 Commandments, honor the mother and the father, I was reminded of something that happened to me years and years ago. So when I was in college, I had the opportunity to go to a vet as part of a work program, to go work at a veterinarian for a day. And there was a point in the day when I was doing it when the vet had to leave. So the vet left, but one of the helpers brought this cat in, and the cat was the first patient that I had. So, the cat came in, the cat looked at me and it said, meow. I looked back at the cat and I said, where?
No.
Meow.
Yeah, I got it. No, we got it.
So that was a dad joke. It's honor the mother of thy father. It's a dad joke. Man, what a crap. Dad joke. Come on. Honor
Becca and I were talking about a time she went before her second graders.
I was purposely not laughing so that you would have to explain it, and then I was going to come in with the laugh.
What I'm going to do is cut out all the
funny.
I'm going to cut out all that awkward silence and make it sound like you guys just jumped in
to the laughter right away.
It's just us like...
Before I even finish the joke, you're going to be laughing.
That's a real knee slapper.
Yeah.
Now, Becca and I were actually talking about a time she gave a joke to her second graders when she was teaching at the classical school. And she's like, why did the chicken cross the road? And they all just kind of looked at her and she goes, because.
Yeah.
Dead silence from second graders. Like the crowd that you think you would get every bit of laughter out of that joke from. And they're just
what
like,
classical education does to you.
That's not funny.
It just kills your joy. It's like, no, I don't want to hear that. Give me Aristotle.
Yes.
I would like Aristotle, man.
Yeah. Mrs. Gilbert, why are we not talking about metaphysics at this point?
Yeah. My father will be
Have you considered
to
Plato's cave? Because inside the cave, that joke might be funny, but now we're on the outside and we see the true form of it.
Yeah.
Not so funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, when I was in Bible college, we had a guest preacher who was also, they had a Christian school at their church. And so he came and he said that before he went, he interviewed some of the elementary school kids to find the best joke to share with the college students before chapel started. And apparently it was a whole thing. And the joke that won out was, what is brown and sticky?
A stick.
A stick, yeah.
Oh,
which was funny, I thought.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean,
I could see how, in elementary school students, I could see how that would just kill,
See, this is what happens. You set the bar really low. You go to those who appreciate you.
Yeah, right.
You're like, I could be a comedian too, I think.
And oddly, out of all the things that I heard in chapel, that stuck with me. So yeah.
All right. So the 5th commandment. Grayson, you wanna kick us off?
Yeah. So today, what we're going to be approaching is the subject of honoring your father and mother. Um, Literally, we're continuing, and obviously the series we have on the Ten Commandments, but the passage itself comes from Exodus 20:12, also Deuteronomy 5:16, I believe. My printer ink is running out, so I can't quite read it. But the passage in Exodus 20:12 says, "Honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land, and the Lord may, or that the Lord is giving you." Um, Deuteronomy 5, honor your mother and father, or father and mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you to do, so that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So, same exact verbiage, pretty much.
Yeah.
What we're dealing with today, though, is really what's the heart behind that. Um, what is the goal with that? Especially, I mean, we were talking a little bit beforehand. In our day and age, especially, this is a confused command, right? Most people have no clue what it means to honor their father and mother. In one side of the ditch, you find people that want to have a knee-jerk reaction against everything that mom and dad did, and for good and bad. Sometimes there's reasons why you look at it and say, mom and dad did everything wrong. And especially if you're raised in a non-Christian home, that becomes kind of a thorny thing, because you can look at it and think, okay, here's what I know they did incorrectly according to the Word of God, if you're at least using that as your standard. But if you're like I was when I first became married, or when Beck and I became married, our goal was to look at things and say, okay, we don't want to do things this way. And we didn't quite really have a scriptural basis behind half of it. What we knew is we didn't like it as kids, and we didn't see it, passing the smell test, so to speak. So the question becomes, in I guess I would say, two different ways. How do you honor your father and mother, especially if you have Christian parents, and how do you do that well? But if you have non-Christian parents, how do you also do that well? Because the command, no matter what, is a straightforward command. It's not contingent on any number of different things. It's not on the basis of how well they raised you, if they were Christian or not. The command is actually quite simple: honor your mom and dad. And so in our culture today, especially, you think of the jokes, okay, boomer, right? And they're funny, don't get me wrong. But there's, I think, a heart behind it much of the time, where we neglect to think of, I guess, that basic principle of showing honor.
Yeah, it's
Like
dismissive.
to the older
Yeah.
generation, the
It's
gray-haired
dismissive, yeah.
ones who have earned that crown of glory, as Proverbs would put it. So much of what we're looking to do today is just discuss that. We'll get into Old Testament passages, New Testament passages, but our focus is really going to be, I guess I would say, more practical, in the sense of, okay, when we're looking at the text, it's not particularly difficult to discern what does it mean by honoring your father and mother. What it comes down to is, how do we do that in practice, and how do we do it to the glory of God, where we don't make concessions on things that we shouldn't, but how do we also do it in a way that, even though it might kick against what mom and dad do, that it still shows them honor and deference as they are due.
Right. I think this is, too, one of the commands that is most easily used as a manipulation from parents. I mean, their parents will use this command wrongly to manipulate not only their children, but their young children, but their adult children also. And then, as Grayson said, it's also one that, because of cultural influence, this is the one that we want to nuance the most. And we want to say, well, what about this? And then this, and well, there's this factor, and there's this thing that hasn't been considered, and this, that, and the other, so that you can make the commandment match exactly your level of comfort. And so it's probably, of all the commands, I think it's probably, in my estimation, the one that has the most daggers put into it, just for, from both sides. So hopefully we can bring a little bit of clarity tonight. And this is a subject that we also kind of covered when we talked about common struggles of Christian life, because we had a question come in about, setting boundaries with parents and in-laws and things like that. And we'll touch on some of those things as well.
Yeah, I agree. Like this, I think with a lot of the Ten Commandments, let's say all the Ten Commandments, there is a tendency that a lot of Christians have to reduce it to the lowest common denominator. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like, and Jesus, when he begins addressing the commandments, he expands it and she goes to the heart of it and digs deep. But we think about honor thy mother and thy father. People I feel it's one of the most glossed over commandments. Like okay, we got that. We understand that.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean? Like you don't really
Yeah.
think about, well, what does this actually mean beyond just being, well, I'm nice to my mom and my dad, right? I try to obey, what I mean? Like we reduce it down to the simplest, most basic of things.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, there's quite a bit of depth to it,
Yeah.
right? I think just by way of introduction, I'll share some thoughts that I have. When the Ten Commandments came on two tablets, a lot of people, we don't necessarily know how they were organized, but a lot of people seem to think the first four were on one because they're vertical oriented, and then the rest were on the separate. We don't know that, but it's a theory, right? But either way, they are kind of broken up where the first four are vertical, and the others tend to be how we interact with one another. And I think it's telling that the very first commandment, when we get to the horizontal, is honor your mother and your father, because the family is the basis. It's the root of all interaction. Like if you mess that up,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't learn how to live with your parents, or how to respond to authority, or to bring honor to the due authority, like you're starting off on a very bad path. In fact, today I was reading some today, and I caught a quote from Augustine. I posted this on the page. You may have seen it, but he says, if someone fails to honor their parents, is there anyone he will spare?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
It's just the precedent. It begins in the house.
Right.
So it's a really important commandment. Again, we can gloss over and be like, oh, I'm nice to my parents. But I think we can gloss over it and miss some of the significance and the precedent and what it trains us and how we
Mm-hmm.
think. And
Mm-hmm.
I also think, it's another one that I think a lot of people tend to think, or at least practically act like it expires at some point. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
like, I moved out, or I'm married, so done with this, that I'm free of this and down to 9 commandments,
Right.
but like the other commandments, there is a perpetuality to them, right? That so anyway, just by way of introduction, some introductory thoughts from my
So in
side.
Proverbs 23:22 says, listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother in her old age.
Yep.
So it shows this full range of,
Yeah.
There's no expiration. And I think a lot of people too, when they approach this commandment, particularly if your relationship's not great with your parents, you only look at the negative side of it. And so a lot of people will say like, well, I'm not saying bad things about my parents, but I'm also not doing there's no positive, blessing toward them either, like we're just totally, separate from each other. We don't talk, we don't communicate, we don't do those things. Therefore, I must somehow be, obedient to this command. And so it just gets really with all the interpersonal aspects of the parent-child relationship. It's the training ground for all other relationships, because there's no relationship that starts off with such a disparity. I mean, if you are a person who mistreats your children, who can't do anything about that, it just shows that you have a terrible character. But if you're a child who can't obey your parents, then you are going to have problems with all kinds of authority, because life is full of, authority, disparities, and everything else as we might view them. So this is, like John said, it's fundamental. Like this relationship in every phase, when you're young, when you're a teenager, when you're 20-somethings, when you move out, when you're older, when your parents are failing in health, all of those stages are going to be different grounds that God will use to conform you into the image of Christ, which, spoiler alert, that's what this command is about.
Yeah, it's actually interesting to me too, because this is one of the areas that, if you think about it, most Christians are very quick to apply the golden rule when it comes to many other familial relationships. With the parents, not so much though, right?
Yeah.
Because you can look back at all the different failures that they've had, and you can look back at the things that perhaps you would do differently, or you are doing differently now. But I always ask the question: Am I even thinking about how my kids would treat me in another 40 years from now, if the Lord lives, or wills that I live that long?
Yeah.
Would I like the same treatment that I give my mother?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, my father passed away years ago. And so for me, it's a double-edged sword in that sense of she's not only a widow, but she's my mother.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's very clear in Scripture. If you do not even take care of your own, as Paul talks about with Timothy in 2 Timothy, you're worse than an unbeliever.
Yeah.
And that has some teeth to it. And what that means very simply, I think we often don't, we think of it maybe in the financial sense of things, because that's kind of the easier portion in America, at least, where we can say, well, I'm contributing towards this financially. But they won't go visit at the nursing home. They won't go take care of mom when she needs a ride to the hospital, or dad when he needs to help around the house because he can't climb on the ladder anymore. They won't go and do basic things because they don't consider the fact that for 20 years, roughly, they were under their tutelage and in their home, actually being cared for every step of the way. And even when they did stupid stuff and deserved the rebuke, maybe for holding the flashlight the wrong way, right? I mean, that's a classic joke.
Yeah.
But they forget essentially what they're going through with their own children. And then they expect somehow when they hit 80 that their children are going to magically give them respect, but they've never shown their own children how it is to honor their own father and mother.
Right. And there's like a bigger gospel picture too. I think we'll get into this as well, because you may even be listening and say, okay, well, that's all well and good for the parents that tried and failed and things like that. I mean, but there may be somebody listening who just literally had just wicked parents.
Yes.
Who did not provide for you well, abandoned you, abused you, all of these, the various rainbow of sins that can take place.
Yeah.
So what does that command look like in honoring your parents? One of the fundamental things that you have to remember with this command, and we'll touch on this in more depth, is that it's not merit-based.
Yep.
It's not based on, well, do they deserve it? Do they deserve good treatment? Do they deserve to be cared for? Do they deserve to be spoken of in a way that is honoring to them? That's not the issue, because if you think about what we have received from Christ, we don't want to be treated according to our own merits. If that's the case, we're in big trouble. So we, as recipients of unmeasurable grace and mercy, have an opportunity with our parents to bestow a fraction, to reflect a fraction of the gospel mercy and grace that we have received from Christ. And, that whole issue of setting down a good pattern for your children. I experienced that in my own life, that my grandmother, my dad's mother, when her health was failing, it was my dad that came in and made sure that she was taken care of, that we'd bring her, meals daily and clean her house and visit and take her on trips with us and all of these different things, while my dad's siblings all were not doing anything.
Yeah.
And had, just living their own lives and doing all that. And as a teenager, even as a non-Christian, I saw that, and there was something that I knew, like, that's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way it's supposed to be. You are supposed to take care of your parents when they get into this condition. And that wasn't even Bible thumping. It was just an understanding of the way that things should be and the way that they should work out.
Yeah.
And that's something that stuck with me.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, there's an older gal at our church right now, and I think of this example just because it's literally in the forefront of my mind. But she has a younger son who is very happy to go race his motorcycles and stuff like that, but he won't come around and help out at the house. And so we'll drive the 15 minutes to get to her house and do a small chore like picking up wood that was sitting in the backyard, and she needs it moved from one spot to another. It's like it's dummy work. It doesn't take much time. It takes actually more time to drive there and back than it does to actually do it half the time. But we were joking around even beforehand where I was helping clean out her garbage disposal because it stopped working, and I pulled out like $4 and change. I'm like, I don't know why there's quarters in here or any of this stuff, but I'm like, okay. But her son couldn't be bothered to do it. And he's a fully able man. He works. He can pay somebody to come in and take a look at it. But he doesn't. And the constant refrain that I get from her is, I wish my son were able to come and just help. And who knows what happened in that relationship. It's not like I'm saying she's been blameless the entirety of her life or that she's never done anything to earn his own spurn. But Blake, you really hit on an important point of it's not merit-based, right? I think of when we were all young kids and moms were changing poopy diapers and feeding us. It's like none of that's merit-based. The very fact that you've been born into the family that you have has been by the sovereign decree of God, and you can either honor your parents and give him glory as he is due in that, or you shirk your responsibilities. And there's really not a different way to cut it. One of the notes I made here is that it doesn't mean you never confront sin. It doesn't mean that you neglect to conform your own lives to a better way, or that you can't do things differently than mom and dad.
Right.
It doesn't mean you're a doormat and you do every single thing that they ever ask you, but it does actually hold some intent behind it, in which you can look at it and say, despite all the different things that perhaps I disagree with and that I think are even downright sinful and wicked in my upbringing, I'm going to walk the way of Christ and condescend to somebody that may not deserve it even,
Right.
and give them a sacrifice by laying my life down in this way. I'm going to put on the apron of a slave, in other words.
Right.
It's the same thing that you look at the Christian life in general, where you might have a person who comes into the church and you don't know them from Adam, and yet they're the person who is particularly difficult to love. And yet, what does Christ call you to do but love them? Perhaps that may be your dad or your mom. We're not saying any of these people are perfect. We're not saying you didn't have a bad upbringing or anything like that. What we are saying, though, is that regardless of the circumstances, God still gives us a very straightforward command.
Right.
And there's things we'll get into shortly about the blessings attached to that. But at the very basis, we have to look at it and say, there's not a bunch of equivocation we can give with regard to what God has said.
Right. I mean, in an easy filter even is just to, as it is with so many things, it's just to look at Christ. Anytime that we try to, abrogate ourselves from this command and saying, well, my parents did this and they did this and they weren't, all this, it's usually that spatial perception of them sinning against us and we didn't deserve to be sinned against. Therefore, I can react by withholding some benevolence from them or whatever. But if you think about it, I mean, Christ is perfect.
Yeah.
And he's raised by Mary and Joseph, who are not perfect. Now, we don't have, details of every little, thing and every little failing of Mary and Joseph. But we know, because they were human, that their parenting and their, good days and bad days and all of that. And here Jesus is perfect, never sinning. Yet you don't see Jesus growing up, getting out of the house and saying, those people hurt me so much. They offended me. Here I am, the perfect son of God. And they, did this, that, and the other thing. In fact, the ultimate exemplification of making sure the full care of the parent
Yes.
is John 19.
Yeah.
Yep.
Christ is literally on the cross. So, needless to say, Christ has other things going on right now. There's other irons in the fire here.
You mean
Yeah.
he's not thinking about the time Joseph was saying, hold the flashlight. Hold the
Yeah,
flashlight.
right.
Yeah.
He's on the cross, right? As the wrath of God for an eternity's worth of punishment towards sin, as the bounds of hell are poured out on Jesus in a time period of 3 hours for the elect. While he's on the cross, he looks down at his mother and looks at John. Mother, behold your son.
Yep.
John, behold your mother. Like placing Mary in John's care. That Jesus is taking, even using his last excruciating breaths to make sure that his mother, his imperfect mother, is cared for. That is just wild.
Yep.
Yeah.
That is wild.
Yeah, I love that text too, because you get the result. You like the very next words, because I have it in front of me, 27. And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her and took her to his own home. Like, Jesus commanded. He's like, "It is going to happen. Do this." And from that moment, like, it's just she's taken care of. Like, he ensured it was going to happen.
Yeah.
Yep.
And also, John wasn't like, "Whoa, I wasn't really financially prepared for this." You know.
I don't know. I'm gonna get exiled in Patmos at one point per house.
I've got 3 dogs. I don't really have room for.
There's really not my
She's
roommate.
she's not my mom.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, none of that. I mean, it's just this beautiful obedience across the board.
Yeah.
So again, the example of Christ is going to be the cherry on top of this command.
Yep.
For sure. Because it's not theoretical. I mean, Christ lives this command out.
Yep.
No, this is a intrinsically practical command. I mean, as Jack mentioned, we're starting to get into the horizontal aspects of the 10 Commandments, and so they're going to be all intrinsically practical at this point. But this one, again, it should be an interesting note for us to say that, okay, this is the very first one. If we don't have a foundation for honoring our father and mother, how can we have a hope to honor the rest of the commandments that are given to us?
Yeah. Right. One of the old tropes that they say, and this just kind of hit me, just flew into my mind here, so this is dangerous territory. But when they say, like, when you're dating someone, they always tell the girl, well, look how he treats his mother.
Right.
Watch how he treats his mother, because that will be, pattern of how, he'll treat you. So, I mean, there's probably an interesting truism to that, I guess.
Yeah, I can tell you the number of times I've actually used that in parenting my own son. I mean, he's 14, he's about to be 15. He's a good kid, but there's still things that I look at and I'm concerned about, obviously, as dad.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest things that
he probably gets a lot of that from his dad. So
yeah, well, yeah. But one of the biggest
raising
things,
you? What is going on here?
What are you doing? Oh yeah.
Oh
yeah.
no.
Well, that actually brings up a different story. So sidebar, there was a point where I was throwing food up in the air and catching it in my mouth, and Silas, as a toddler, was just, he was beside himself laughing. And Becca looks at me and she's like, you shouldn't do that. You're teaching him. I'm like, it'll be fine.
It's fun.
The next day at work, I get a picture because Silas had thrown up his entire plate of spaghetti and tried to catch it in his mouth.
Yeah.
I was just like, yeah.
And you text back, well, did he?
Did he catch any of it, though?
Yeah.
It's like,
how much did he get in?
I'm proud of you, boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I've used that a number of times in parenting with him, of just saying, look, buddy, the way you treat your mom is, it is a litmus test in some ways of how you're going to treat your wife. And there's nothing more flagrant in my mind than coming home and finding out he's been disrespectful to her all day. In that's going to bring the most severe punishment. That's going to bring dad's wrath, so to speak.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So what does it mean then in short, the commandment, right? Well, Grayson touched on this a minute ago. I think just in general, It means that we are to be people who seek to give deference to our parents, despite whatever they've come from, however they acted. Again, as we mentioned a moment ago, that we don't do that because of how they are. We do it because of God placed them to be your parents. God put them as the initial training ground of authority for you for whatever reason. Right. So in that regard, we think of these things in principle, not necessarily in terms of merit. And I think that's a key point for anyone who wrestles with bad parents. Like it's a faith thing. I mean, this is a faith thing. It's a, am I going to bear my cross and follow Christ? Am I going to trust God's word that what it says is good and true?
Right.
I mean, we live in a, we've talked about this before, but we live in a culture that has forgotten this. And I think a lot of the reasons we are where we're at is because so much of this has fallen apart, where kids hate their parents. I mean, I grew up in a time when half the songs on the radio were about blaming my mom and my dad, like Stained and, all these, when I was in high school, that's what the music was. It was like my mom, my dad ruined me, that, there was so much of that.
Yep.
TV, we've talked about this before too. TV in the 90s and 2000s is all about how the dad is the bumbling idiot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's just parents are bad. And like, so a good example of this, my wife and I have been watching, be very quick, but we've been going back through Home Improvement. Sorry. Home Improvement. And, sorry, wrong
Home
Home.
Alone in March. All right.
Very, very different.
Very cool.
Yeah. We're very Christmas oriented. But no, Home Improvement. And I liked it when I was a kid. It's kind of an interesting show to watch as an adult, because when I was a kid, I wanted to identify with like Jonathan Taylor Thomas, because he was cool and he would smart off to his dad. He always had these sarcastic remarks. And as a grown up, you watch it now and it's just a totally different watching experience. But funny show, like it has its moments. But what I notice over and over again, the dad is no source of wisdom whatsoever. Every problem that happens, who does he go to? He goes to Wilson. You remember the guy behind the fence? Yeah. Wilson, who is not the father, is always the source of wisdom. He gives it to Tim, and then Tim like messes it up, and then everything falls apart. But then his wife is, "Oh, we love you anyway, honey." Yeah. And that's the episode. See, right?
You could do an ultra spiritual move here and just say Wilson, because his face is veiled, is like the No, we won't go that far. That's blasphemy.
That's a Gospel Coalition article. Finding the Gospel.
Finding the Gospel in Home Improvement. 10 ways but anyway. That Wilson is like your father in heaven.
Speaking of improving your home.
Improve your soul. Yeah. But all that to say, like we live in a culture. We live in a culture that is just generally forgotten the proper order of these things.
Yeah.
And so many of us have grown up in a culture that doesn't understand this. Mm-hmm. So anyway, all that to say, we scriptures call us to faith. Scriptures call us to obedience. This is God's law. It's God's moral law.
Yeah.
And you are to respect and give deference and honor to your parents because of who they are, not what they've done.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, reiterating, it does not mean you don't confront sin. It does not mean that you're a doormat or that you never set boundaries, with your parents. We're not saying that at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not at all.
There's points where.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead, Blake. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. No, you're good. I was just going to say, we'll talk about a little bit of what that looks like.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a point where you also recognize I have to carve out a radically different path.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just because that path was never quite laid before me and showing me the true and proper way to go. So for some of you, you might be looking at every bit of your childhood and saying, yeah, but I literally am the first generation Christian and you don't know my upbringing. It's like, well, actually, I probably have more in common with you than you think, because I was raised in a non-religious home. There was no semblance of what it meant to honor the Lord in the home. There was, if I want to get down to the, all the nasty details, it's like pretty much every day was an exercise in blasphemy. So for us, it was looking at things on my side where I looked at it and thought, okay, there's a very different path I have to carve out. Even with my wife, she was raised in a Christian home, but it was, Dad didn't lead Mom obviously had her foibles as well and wasn't submissive. And so we both looked at things and said, we have to chart a new course here. Well, that's what we would also say is honoring your father and mother, is that you're going back to the heart of God's commandments and saying, in spite of all that, though I'm choosing a different path, I'm still going to honor them in the midst of it. And it goes back to the proverb you quoted earlier, Blake, right? Your father gave you life. Your mother in her old age will still be there. Regardless of whatever circumstances you may have been through, there's an aspect in which you look at that and say, okay, again, through the sovereign plan of God, this is how he chose to bring me into this world. And so long as I am here and have those existing relationships, I'm going to just give a basic sense of honor. It was like, so I picture it this way, right? Everybody loves to hate on the president of the United States. Doesn't matter who it is. There's all sorts of different things you can be upset by. When it was Biden, it was everything, against Biden. When it's Trump, you can have everything against Trump. You can be grateful for all sorts of different things on a more conservative side, but at the same time, you look at it, if you're at least reasonable, and think, yeah, there's some things here that are not quite right. But if you were to meet the man, would you snub him? Would you be a complete jerk? And would you treat him in an unchristian manner? Biden, Trump, Obama, whoever you want to put into that seat, I don't care. The point is still the same. Because of the position that he's in as a figure of authority that God has placed over you, do you give him the deference and honor as the one that God has placed there?
Yeah.
Right. Again, exemplified by Christ,
Yep.
Yeah.
Even Christ talking to Pilate, he carries himself in such a way that, Now, granted, he does say that all the authority that Pilate has been given to him by God. He speaks the truth and does all those, But it's, but yeah.
I think about Jonathan and Saul, or David and Jonathan and Saul, like that relationship. Like if you're familiar with the story, like Saul was not a great guy, not a very good father. No. But both of them, generally speaking, tried to honor who he was. Now he was king as well, but there was a respect for who he was in the relationship. And, David even had the chance to take the problem out, so to speak, and to fix the problem. And he didn't, right?
Who am I to touch the Lord's anointed?
Exactly. So
you would think though, with observation, because I love what Grayson said about how you have this opportunity to look at the things that your parents did well, if they did things well, what things they did well, and what things they did not well, like what things you would want to emulate and things you wouldn't want to emulate. Like that's very good. And that is a very wise and godly way to look at things and to assess, this is what my parents did good. This is what they didn't do well. This is what we want to do better for our kids and show better and, things like that. But it's especially strange to me that you see in scripture guys like David, who is a bad father.
Yep.
I mean, there's just no way, there's just really no other way to cut it. Yeah. And you would think that David seeing, not only his relationship with his own father, but then seeing the relationship with Jonathan and Saul and things like that, you would think that he would sit back and say, there's some things that I want to make sure I'm doing, correctly, proper discipline and up to the right level of discipline and what's appropriate and all of those things, which Saul obviously had a hard time with. And, so even the man after God's own heart drops the ball in the parenting realm.
Yeah.
In big ways, major ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it goes back to the heart of what we were saying earlier. And this is, I guess, maybe a transition point for us in the podcast, but the command is not given respective to how well they do. If they failed, there's a point in which you can recognize that they did the best that they possibly could at that point. Or perhaps they could have done much, much better, but that doesn't revoke the command.
Yeah.
And this is the same as every other command that's given in scripture. I remember a conversation I had at one point with somebody, and it was like, well, yeah, you have all sorts of different things going on right now that can make it understandable
Mm-hmm.
to where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the scriptures don't say, and
Our circumstances
people with-
never give us an excuse to sin.
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So again, we can't look at it and say, but my parents, they were failures. Congratulations. Just like every other parent that's ever existed, ever, who is a sinner and would look back on their life and say, you know what? I think I would do some things different,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and again, there's plenty of things I can look back on and just be like, holy cow, I would never do that. And then there's also things I look back in my own life as a parent at this point and think,
right.
My gosh, how the heck did I do that?
Yeah.
Does it stress you out that one day our kids will be older and they'll be making decisions like, I'm not going to do what he did,
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes I think about
I encourage
what
my
are those
kids in that,
things? Like,
actually,
my kids aren't going
I've
to say
talked with
that,
all of our kids about that at this point of just saying, look, mom and dad are not perfect, and my hope is that you do better than we have done.
Blake's kids are going to ask him, Dad, will you write a book and tell me exactly to do what you did so I can so I can replicate.
My kids are all young enough right now that
Animal
they haven't realized
husbandry.
how dumb I am. So
It's a glorious stage, brother. Enjoy it.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
they're still like, man, Dad is just.
Yep.
Whew.
Dad is awesome.
Yeah, Dad is awesome.
Well,
I love that.
I mean,
guy.
I can think of plenty of examples where. So the command to children in Ephesians 6:1, right? Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. But Paul also gives a command to fathers. What's that command? Do not exacerbate
Yeah,
your
don't
children.
provoke them to anger.
Yeah.
And
Provoke anger.
lest you provoke them to anger. And it's like, well, heck, I can do that just trying to joke around with them. And just, you kind of subtly poke. And this is kind of the Gilbert way it's always been, is the more we make fun of you, the more we actually love you. But there's been times where,
Gilbert
as
way.
yeah. So if believe it, folks, if we make fun of you on the page, it's just because we love you, not because we think.
That's if Grayson makes fun of you.
Yeah, just
That's
me.
the case.
That's not the lab
Yeah, right.
And we don't sign who posted anything on the page, so your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
My rule
like
is
our
if you don't like the post,
like
it's
our
one of the other two.
Like our text earlier today, Jack. I didn't mean it to be charitable.
But there's been a few times where I've done it with my own kids, where I'm trying to tease them and have a fun time, and then all of a sudden it's like I hit the right button and hit it real hard, not even being aware because I'm pleasantly aloof half the time, and then it's now we got to sit down and talk through it, and I have to seek forgiveness, but
right.
I mean, we all do it, right, in different ways.
Yeah. Yep. It happens.
But it was that realization of just like how easily I can break the commandment that God has given me as a father.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So the point there is, again, honor your mother and father. And there's more to it, especially as we look to the Old Testament. But the general principle is actually quite simple. There's nothing deep there. It doesn't matter if they've been bad parents. It doesn't matter if they've been indifferent parents. It doesn't matter if they've been good parents. At the end of the day, the command is actually quite simple. Regardless of however they've parented you, there is that command to honor them. And how we do that might look a little bit differently. And it's going to look different from house to house, especially because each household's unique.
Yeah.
But the command is still the same.
What are some ways? So I'm assuming that most of our listeners are probably adults with adult parents. So what are some ways then, just practically kind of rapid fire, that we can honor parents that we're not under their roof anymore, whether they're great parents or whether they weren't so great parents? What are some ways to practically do that?
First and foremost, that you live a life that is conformed to the Word of God. Mm-hmm. Everything else is going to flow from that. But if you make it your desire and your heart's purpose to honor the Lord, you will thereby honor your parents. And again, that could mean you charting very, very different course than them.
Mm-hmm.
Often it actually will look like that just because you're dealing with sinners.
Sure.
But for the person that was raised in a home, especially if it was a bad home, the best way you honor your mom and dad, even if you don't have contact with them anymore, just because of the way things shook out, is by charting that new course.
Okay.
So you do things a different way. You don't abuse the kids. You don't become the drunkard.
Mm-hmm.
You don't become the philanderer or the thief or the liar or anything else. You are the one who is upright, and you teach your children to be upright and honest and fear the Lord as well.
Yeah, I think Grayson, I think that's a great point. Just living a Christ-like life and pursuing Christ, I think, is a great way. I think practically, Blake, to some of the questions that you asked, I think I think there's simple ways and big ways, but practically, some simple things, not talking back to them, right? Whether you're 6 years old or 36 years old.
Yeah. Right.
I think when we get older, we feel more freedom to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of people, so not talking back to them, not silently cursing them or talking about them behind their backs, speaking well of them.
Yeah. I think that was one of the ones that we brought out when we did our other podcast. That was one that stuck out to me, was just that where you can, giving them the benefit of grace, speak well of them in the areas that you can. Not lying about like, my parents were great when they really weren't great, but if there was anything good, if there was anything commendable, if there was anything lovely, speak on those things. And that you don't have to. One way to honor your parents too is that you don't have to drag all of their failings out for the whole world to see.
Right.
Because it doesn't change anything and it doesn't help anything. And so love covering a multitude of sins says they know that they screwed up in some areas. I know that. I wouldn't want all of my failings just paraded and talked about, around for everybody. And so one way that I can honor my parents is speaking well of them where I can, and refusing to badmouth them in areas that they failed.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think another practical way is, quite literally, just giving them thanks.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think of different things that, when I was a young kid, I had the world figured out, right? And then I became an adult, and I realized there were things that I didn't have figured out. I became a husband and a father, and there was even more revealed to me. And there was a point where I just looked at my mom, and I first said, "I'm sorry." There was no context given. I was just like, "I'm sorry." And she looked at me and she said, "It's okay." And then I said, "Thank you." Again, no context. And she goes, "You're welcome."
That's the Gilbert way right there.
Yeah, but it was like there was much more communicated
First they're
behind.
sour, then they're sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We make fun of you, then we say thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the good time for me, because I just got to make fun of you at your expense.
Right.
Yeah, I think too, Blake, are you taking time being intentional about trying to strengthen your relationship with them? I think that's a way you can do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And there may be cases where it just doesn't work. Like, and again, and we love nuance. So if you know the page, you know how much we love a good heaping helping of nuance. But
I can't hold all this nuance.
Right. There may be cases. It may be that your parent is just a world-class manipulator. Okay. Well, you know that, and then you know what boundaries that you need to draw for that not to happen. Maybe your parents are just like super mean and bitter and things like that, and so what areas you need to draw boundaries and all of that. But in spite of those things, like Jack said, there still can be attempts to have relationship. At least some sort of sociable relationship that allows your children to know their grandparents.
Yeah.
And to maybe start rebuilding some of the things that were broken apart between you and your parents. I would say, without revealing any details of anything, myself and my siblings and my parents have been through a lot of hurt, a lot of sin, a lot of different things. And by God's grace, and truly, truly, truly by God's grace, He is working us through the process right now of being a stronger family than we were previously.
Praise God. Yeah.
Yep.
And there's been a lot of, and there's had to been a lot of, confronting sin and confessing sin and forgiving sin. And, I guess, what's weird is how much sin screws everything up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like we're shocked by that fact.
Yeah, right.
Like, hey, Genesis 3 actually happened, guys.
Wait a second.
Every single time we're like, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. But we keep falling for, just in general, mankind keeps falling for the allurement that sin will bring, peace and pleasure and things like that. And I think a lot of Christians who seek to just cut off their parents because of some failing of their parents or some relational thing, they think that that's going to bring peace. Yeah. But it doesn't. Because if you're a Christian, it still eats you up because it's just been undealt with, unaddressed, this, that, and the other thing. So speaking well of them where you can, seeking to actually, have some relationship with them within boundaries if boundaries need to be set. What was the one that you said, Grayson?
I don't remember at this point.
It was really good too.
It was mock them because you love them.
Yeah,
was that it?
Oh no, apologize. Thank them. That's what it was. Yeah, no,
that's it.
Yeah, no.
Go up, you bald head.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Like apologize them. Like apologize to them if you need to, and thank them for the areas that they got right. I mean, imagine what it would mean to your parent, whether if they were good parents or bad parents, that if you at some point this week called them up and said, and thought of 2 or 3 things that they did well, and said, I just was thinking about this week, and I want to thank you for boom, boom, boom. Yeah. I mean, that would absolutely, that would fire their furnaces probably for the remainder of the year. Yeah. And you wouldn't even have to talk to them the rest of the year. No, I'm just kidding. Just drop a compliment and leave.
Well, but again, I think of my young adulthood where, again, I had everything figured out in my mind. And again, there's same as Blake, there's plenty of things that I could look at and say, let's just drag it all out, right? And we can be very, very blunt and very real about it. But the point is different than that. It's like, despite all the failings, I can still look at my father. I mean, he's long past at this point. I can still look at my father and say, okay, there's things now that I understand that I just didn't then. Mm-hmm. The frustration he had with me was not utterly improper because there were some things that I was doing at that time that were just stupid.
Yeah, right.
And he had proper indignation. It may have been carried too far at different points, but it's like, no, that was actually wrong. And if my son did that, what would I do? Right. I would discipline him. I would chastise. I would bring him back to the word. Right. And I mean, there's different ways I would handle it than my own dad did, but it's still me looking back at it. And it's like, okay, I can look back on those years that at that point I felt nothing but contempt and think, oh boy, what a fool were you, where you couldn't see that your dad actually just cared for you and loved you. Yeah. And he may have done it in the wrong way because he didn't know how to do it well, but nobody taught him. Right. It certainly was not modeled to him.
Grace. Right. You have to give your parents the benefit of grace and say maybe they weren't perfect, but there were, maybe there were things that played into it. My own dad. Okay. So I love my dad. I really do. And he's a great guy. But he had a really rough childhood. His dad died when he was a little kid. And then his mother remarried, and then his stepdad died when he was a teenager. And so then it was just really rough after that. And so, I've thought about multiple times, like, man, dad and all of his older brothers were not good fathers at all, like to their kids. Yeah. So he had no example. Like I've thought about this multiple times. Like my dad was just shooting blindly into the dark,
Yeah.
parenting us, because he had no one to say like, oh, this is what my dad did, or this is how my dad did it, or this is something I would do different than my dad. Like he had no basis for any of that at all, except for just a very, very young age. And then even that was, some rough years for him. And that thought has helped me just be able to graciously pass over, some of the failings of my own dad.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And another way that I think we can practically, as adults, we can practically honor our mother and father is consider ways that we can care and honor them for their position in life. Right. And I think that may be financially, it may not. It may be caring for them physically, probably at some point.
Yeah.
And that can look different for everyone. We're going through that now is, we're trying to convince, my parents live about 6 hours away, and which is just far enough to be majorly inconvenient,
Right.
Because if it's like 2 hours, you can, so, but we're having discussions, and we'll see if in the next year or two it happens, about trying to get my parents to move closer to us so that we can help out.
Right.
There, and we would go there, but they are in the, middle of nowhere, East Texas. Like it would be, much difficult. Plus my wife's parents are here too, and that way, So anyway, but all that to say, like, look for ways to care for them in their position in life, whatever that.
It was a big consideration for us, especially as I was candidating, where I was looking for jobs all over the country, and quite literally Texas, Florida, Missouri, North Dakota. It's like everywhere. And the thing that was in the background of my mind was, okay, what about mom?
Mm-hmm.
And what about my wife's parents?
Right.
Because they're getting older too. So for us, it was that conscious decision in one sense of saying, we not only have ties here because of just the longevity we've been in Wisconsin, but it was looking at it and saying, if we go halfway across the country, what does that mean for them? Well, for her parents, it would be much easier. For my mom, she would have followed, I think, but it would also be financially extremely difficult.
Yeah.
Right.
So everything we also did was say, okay, if we do move, how do we have something with like a mother-in-law suite, where we can just say, just come, and you don't have to worry about buying anything.
Yeah. Right. I think just as a side note for our older listeners, I think, and you guys may disagree with this, I don't think you will, but you might. I think that it is, if you are an older individual and you're reaching a point where you need, or you're approaching maybe the need of care, extra assistance, or even that it would just be beneficial to have your kids around. If your children are established somewhere, they've got a family, work, church, all of those things, it is not their responsibility to move to you. It is your responsibility to move to them. Because you may not like it, but you are the one that is in need of care, potentially, and in need of help, potentially. And though that may be humbling, I think it is wise to say, I cannot uproot my children from their lives, so I will take the necessary steps to go to them if they are willing to help me and to care for me. That is the only thing in my mind that makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's, again, fundamentally wise, but there's also the reality, a very pleasant reality, especially if they've got grandbabies. Like, why would you not want to be around your family in those last days? Right. Where you can see the future generations and see what God is doing, and be perhaps part of that.
Exactly. But I think parents grasp too tightly to independence.
Yeah.
And
I
there's
think people in general do.
Yeah. So I think that there's there's just I don't know. I'm trying to in my mind right now as I'm thinking about it, I'm trying to formulate a biblical example. I want to say, so what I'm trying to think through this like real time. Because when Abraham went up out of the Ur of Chaldees, he took Laban with him. Right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
If not, we'll get corrected, I'm sure.
Yeah. Leave it.
Yeah,
leave
and
in
no
the
big deal
comment.
there. I mean, please correct us.
Hopefully
But
it's. Yeah, we're open to correction. I mean, we learned today that Baptists are not Reformed, so.
well, I
I've
have
been telling you that
maintained
for
as
years.
a
I
Baptist
don't.
that we're not Reformed.
Welcome to the club, my guy. Yeah. Jack, is that your
I'm
page? Jack,
I'm
is
the
that your
Baptist.
page? It's time to own up to it.
What page?
The guy that commented, the
It's
page
not.
name is literally called "Baptists Are Not Reformed."
Oh, that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that
And-
one.
yeah.
No.
Oh, that.
Oh,
no,
man.
this is the first time hearing about this. Right.
It's like,
yeah.
Is that a
You-
page? What's a page?
Yeah, a page on
Yeah.
what? Yeah. Right.
well, depending on the context, it might be just a peasant boy who comes and helps you with some things here and there.
Yeah.
Talk about having an axe to grind with a particular topic. Like
Yeah,
I-
that's like Leighton Flowers level.
Yeah. If you're,
I'm
Anyway.
that petty.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
going to say
Yeah.
Baptists are not Reformed. If you're listening, time to get married, have children,
leave the basement.
and just,
Sell your cat.
dear
leave
brother,
your basement.
you've got some ground to break here.
Yeah.
No. I've been called
Meanwhile,
worse
his
things.
parents
I've been
are,
called
you know,
worse things
Baptist.
than not Reformed. I'll tell you that.
I've been called a lot worse than that. Yeah. I mean, I hear that now and I'm like, well, technically you are correct. I mean, if we're going to look at it historically and theologically, I guess that would be the case. And they're like, well,
Yeah.
why are you agreeing with me
Yeah.
now?
Right.
Because it's
Don't
true.
agree with
I
me.
don't-
Don't agree
Yeah.
with me that you're not Reformed. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's some practical application and conversation on those things. We were just considering we're like an hour in already. And there's still so much to cover because we want to look at things that Christ says in the New Testament and some commands we have there. We especially want to look at this being the first command with a promised blessing that comes along with it, and some application of things that way. There's also another really big area of talking about the extent of this command. If you're familiar with a lot of the Puritan writers and things like that, this idea of honoring authority, that the practice ground is the parents, and then it's got all of these other applications with government and all of, different aspects of family and things like that. So what we're going to do is we will pick this up again in a part 2 of the 5th commandment and cover out some of the rest of those things, have some more practical application. I think it'll be real good. Any thoughts from you boys?
No. The only thing. Nah, I'm good. I'll save it till next time.
now
He's
I'm
like,
curious.
Yeah. Oh,
Well, what
I don't-
was it? I don't know.
If you're gonna ask me to talk, I'll just talk. But
Yeah,
no, no, I'll save it till next time. I'm teasing the listeners to come back.
Yeah.
What
right,
is
yeah,
Jack
no,
going to
it's
say?
true.
They're going to
Yeah,
think about it
yeah.
nonstop for the next
Jack
2 weeks.
had some deep thought.
It's
Everybody be
Deep Thoughts
quiet.
with
We're
Jack
listening to
Handy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Deep thoughts with Jack Handy. Yeah.
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 Very good.
The big thing at the end of the day, what we're trying to say is with this, think in terms of a principle. Again, this is going to be much of the Christian life in general. It's easy to get bogged down when it comes to looking at a command and saying this is precisely how it has to flesh out in my life. Again, we're hitting things very broadly, and we don't know your context or your background, all the relationships you have with your family, if you even have a relationship with your family.
Mhm.
But there are various different ways that we have to go back to the heart of the command, and that's essentially, we hit it a number of times, but honor your father and mother, And the reason for it is that we are looking ultimately to honor our Father in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And so I gravitate towards those who have broken families in just my terms of thinking. But whoever you are, the way that I've always thought about it, give thanks for what you have been given, but look at it truthfully with a lens towards Scripture and say, how can I do better? Even if you had the best parents in the world, that's always appropriate and wise to do. And remember at the end of the day that in every which way that your father and mother may have failed, you have a God who has never failed and will never fail.
Mm-hmm.
And as you look to that, if he's the one that can look at you and I and say, here's our obligation as Christians, and he looked at Israel and said, here's your obligation, I don't think we have much leeway to say otherwise there. What we have to do is just simply look at how can we obey that and do it so faithfully.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, well said. How about I'll kick in the theme music here in just a second. It'll start playing. We won't hear it, but the people will hear it. And I'll give some sweet words to imparting from the Heidelberg Catechism. So close your eyes, listener.
Unless you're driving.
Unless yes, don't.
Yeah, then please keep them open.
Don't listen to us if you're driving.
You know what?
No.
Scratch that. Don't close
your
your
eyes.
eyes.
Close your eyes and
actually open them wider. Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone tells you
repeat Paul's line. To die is gay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, but question 104 of the Heidelberg Catechism. What does God require in the fifth commandment? Answer. That I show all honor, love, and faithfulness to my father and mother, and to all those in authority over me, submit myself with due obedience to their good instruction and discipline, and also have patience with their weaknesses and shortcomings, since it is God's will to govern us by their hand. Amen.
Heidelberg is so stupidly good with stuff like that.
We should have just read that. It'd been a lot
that's all
shorter.
Episode
We wasted
done.
a lot of time just
Yeah.
now by not just reading the Heidelberg Catechism.
If you want a better version of the podcast, just read the Heidelberg.
Just read, yeah. That's
Yeah.
basically
Soundbite
it.
that and send that part to your friends.